You've come to something absolutely fundamental now, Sir Isaiah, and what I'd like to do, if I may, is, as it were, recapitulate how we've got to the point we're at before we start making further forward moves. Yes. I take it that what you're saying is that throughout the history of mankind, men in their search for knowledge have asked most commonly two kinds of questions. In the first place, there are questions about the world. Man is simply finding out about and mastering his environment and coping with his environment. And questions about the world are answered by looking at it, by investigation, observation, testing, experiment, and so on.
Yes.
These are factual questions. The second kind of question are questions of a more abstract or formal kind, like questions in mathematics or in logic or, as you said, in games or in heraldry. And with questions of this kind, you can't find out the answer by observing the world, because questions of this kind concern the interrelationships between entities inside formal systems, the one we most commonly use obviously being that of arithmetic or more generally mathematics. So you have empirical questions about the world, which involve looking at the facts, and formal questions which involve relating one thing to another inside a formal system. And that nearly all knowledge, nearly all questions fall into one of these two baskets, so to speak. Now, what you're saying is, I take it, that philosophical questions, the hallmark of a philosophical question is that it doesn't fall into either of these baskets. A question like what is a right is something that you can neither find the answer to by looking out of the window, nor find the answer to by looking at the internal coherence of a formal system. And therefore, you don't know how to go about finding the answer. And this possession of a question without any understanding of how to look for the answer is, as it were, the hallmark of a philosophical question. Is that
You put it
right?
far better than I have, yes, much more clearly.
Well,
I
you
accept
put it first.
Yes, but I accept this reformulation of it with pleasure.
Yeah.
Pleasure,
Well, now, these are very fundamental questions, and we don't know how to go about answering them. What are we to do with questions that we don't know how to answer? I mean, what progress can we make with them, and how do we make progress?
Well, you have to ask historical questions. Why do we admire the thinkers who have treated them? We admire the thinkers who have treated them because they've managed to reformulate the questions, usually in such a manner, as to make certain answers at least seem plausible. When there isn't a fixed method for doing a thing, you do what you can. That is to say, you simply worry the thing out. You say, well, now, when I ask a question like, do things have a purpose? What is it like? What kind of question is it? What sort of answer am I looking for? What would be the kind of argument which would lead me to think it's true or false? And this is what I think philosophy is about. Ian Forster once said, everything is like something. What is this like? This is exactly what you do in the case of philosophical questions. When there isn't any obvious method of doing it, you do what you can. And historically, what has happened is this, I think. Certain questions have been in this rather confused condition. Important, crucial. People have worried themselves deeply about them, and indeed rightly, because they affect their ultimate values to a large extent. And they didn't quite know how to set about them. Those who were dogmatic, who simply accepted the pronouncements of sacred books or of inspired teachers, of course, didn't worry. But there were always people a little bit skeptical about this and who asked themselves, why should we accept these answers? They say that, but do we know that they know? How do we know that they do know? They say God said so, but of course God seems to say very different things to different people. How do we know which is true? Historically, I think what has happened is that some of these questions have been so reformulated they fall into one of the other two baskets, historically speaking. For example, let me explain what I mean. Take astronomy. In the 12th century, it was perfectly right to say that astronomy was a philosophical subject. Why? Because it wasn't purely empirical, and it wasn't formal. Because people thought that planets went in circles because the circle was a perfect figure. Now, the proposition that the circle is a perfect figure is not an empirical proposition, and it isn't a formal proposition. Why one should believe it is another question. It certainly isn't neither of those. You can't prove it by experiment, and you can't prove it by mathematical proof. So this is obviously a metaphysical truth. So long as metaphysics entered, and people knew that stars had to do certain things, planets had to do certain other things, the sun had to do certain things, so long as they knew, and they knew on metaphysical or theological grounds, it was perfectly properly philosophical. Then, I needn't tell you how, everyone knows, astronomy gradually became an observational science. It shed its metaphysical presuppositions, and it is now a respectable part of what might be called the physical, i.e. empirical sciences. And in this way, it ceased to be philosophical. And one of the interesting things about the career of philosophy is that it constantly sheds certain parts of itself into one of these two baskets. I think it was my colleague Austin who once put this truth in the form of this hypothesis that the great sun gradually secretes out of itself the other planets. And as the other planets become independent, great masses of burning gas become planets, they acquire an independent life of their own. This has been, to a large extent, the history of philosophy. In this way, for example, I suppose economics is part of philosophy when it was mixed up with a lot of a priori beliefs, metaphysical assumptions, but then it gradually became a empirical science.
But there remains also, even when the sciences or when the other fields of inquiry have hived off on their own, like economics or astronomy or psychology or linguistics or whatever it might be, there remains in a very important sense, doesn't there, a philosophy of almost any subject you care to name. What I have in mind is this, that in any field of activity there are certain fundamental terms, or I prefer, I think, to say fundamental concepts that people use. For example, physicists are constantly talking about light, mass, energy, velocity, gravity, motion, measurement, time. Or politicians are constantly using terms like freedom, equality, social justice. Or lawyers are constantly using terms like guilt, innocence, justice again, though they mean something different by it. And usually the people practically involved in these fields of activity don't argue about the terms they're using. I should think most physicists go through the whole of their lives without arguing with another physicist about what light is or what they mean by the term energy. But the philosopher of science comes along and says, well, what exactly do we mean by light? What do we mean by measurement? What are we doing when we measure something? Or the political philosopher comes along and says, yes, but what exactly do we mean by freedom? What do we mean by equality? And there's even a philosophy of law, and the philosopher of law comes along and says, well, what exactly do we mean by justice? In other words, one of the activities of philosophy, surely, is to elucidate and analyze the concepts, the fundamental concepts that are used, characteristically used in each different area of human thought and human activity.
I think this is right.
Aren't these philosophical questions like what is time, what is light, what is good? They have something in common with children's questions, in fact, don't they?
Yes, I've often thought that. Children ask these questions of their elders. They say, they don't say what is time, they don't say that. But what they say is, why can't I meet Napoleon? Supposing a child said that, seems quite a natural thing for a child to do. And you say, you can't, he's dead. And then you say, well, why does this prevent one? And then if the father is sophisticated, he has to explain that death means his body becomes dissolved in the ground, he can't be resurrected, it happened a long time ago. And then if the child's at all sophisticated, a sophisticated child would say, well, can't all the bits be brought together again? And then the father says, no, they can't. What kind of can't? And then a lesson in physics follows. And the child says, no, I don't really want that. I don't want Napoleon now. I want to go back to see him as he was at the Battle of Austerlitz. That's what I'd like. Well, you can't, says the father. Why not? Because you can't move back in time. Why can't I? Then we have a philosophical problem. What is meant by can't? Is not being able to move back in time the same sort of can't as when you say twice 2 can't be 7? Or the same sort of can't as when you say you can't buy cigarettes at 2 o'clock in the morning because there's a law against it. Or I can't remember. Or I can't make myself 9 foot tall by merely wishing it. What sort of can't? What sort of must? And then we're plunged into philosophy straight away. And then you have to say, well, the nature of time. And then some people will say, no, there isn't such a thing as time. Time is just a word for before and after and simultaneously with. To talk about time as if it was a kind of thing is a metaphysical trap. And we're launched. Well, most fathers don't want to answer questions to children that way. They just tell them to shut up and not ask silly questions, go and climb a tree, as it were. But these are the questions which constantly recur, and philosophers are the people who are not terrified of them and are prepared to deal with them. Children, of course, ultimately are conditioned not asking these questions. More's the pity. The children who are not so conditioned turn into philosophers.
I think you need to say a little more about this, because I think one of the hardest things for the layman is to see what kind of illumination can be got out of trying to answer unanswerable questions.
Well, they're not
How can you make progress?
They're not unanswerable. They're not unanswerable. You can make some way towards an answer. They're not unanswerable by clarifying the concept. Sometimes you discover that the question has been falsely put. Sometimes you discover it's an empirical question, muddled up with a formal question. All kinds of things happen. But if you really want me to, let me give an example of sort of thing I'm trying to say. Take moral philosophy again, which is quite a good example because most people have moral problems in their lives. Now, what should we say? Supposing we ask a partly moral, partly political question. Supposing we say this. An ordinary question in a hospital. There is a kidney machine. It costs a very great deal. There are not very many of them. Many people have kidney disease for which this machine might be useful. Should we use these machines only for important people because they confer a lot of benefits in society? If there is a very important scientist who suffers from kidney disease, should the kidney machine be reserved for him in a fortnight's time, or there is some innocent child dying for which the kidney machine might save? How do we decide? What are we to do? Supposing there aren't enough machines to go around, what do we do? Should we put such questions to ourselves as which of these is going to benefit society most? This is an agonizing question of practice. Well, the moral philosopher is not going to give an answer to that and say, no, save the great scientist, save the child, doesn't matter which. What it will do, a good moral philosopher will explain to you what are the kind of considerations involved. They'll say, well, now what are you asking? Are you entirely concerned about the happiness of mankind? Is that your only consideration? If it is, then I just say it's right to save the scientist because he'll probably confer greater benefits than this child, however innocent. Or do you also believe that all men are equal and that all men have equal claim to be saved, and one mustn't even ask which of these people is more important? Is this your thought? Well, you see there is some conflict of values here. On the one hand, you believe in increasing human happiness. On the other hand, you believe there is something wrong in obviously preferring some to others and creating a kind of hierarchy of claims.
When you said that the moral philosopher wouldn't tell you what to do in the case of your example of should we use the kidney machine for the scientist or the child, I think you said something extremely important for our present discussion, because I think a lot of people come to philosophy wanting to be told how to live, or wanting to be given an explanation of the world or an explanation of life or something. And it seems to me that to have that desire is an abnegation of personal responsibility. One shouldn't want to be told how to live. One shouldn't want definitive answers. But it's an entirely different thing to want clarification of one's life, clarification of issues, and so on, so that one personally can take decisions and take responsibility for oneself.
It's a painful thing you are saying, but of course I agree with it. Most people want to be given answers. One of the things I remember very well, Turgenev, when he's writing about his own writings, says one of the troubles about his novels, why they're not more admired than they should be, is the Russian reader in the 19th century wants to be told how to live. And he wants to be quite clear about who are the heroes and who are the villains. And Turgenev, doesn't do this. Tolstoy did it, Dostoevsky did it, a lot of other writers do it. In Dickens, there's no doubt who is good and who is not. But Turgenev says, all I do is paint human beings as they are. I don't guide the reader. I don't tell him on which side, so to speak, I myself stand. And this irritates them, annoys them, leaves them hanging in some sort of way, and people hate that. It's not the business of the moral philosopher any more than it's the business of the novelist to guide people in their lives. What his business is to face them with the alternatives, with the issues, explain to them what they're choosing among, and then, in the light of whatever it is they believe, they must plump.
There is, of course, one philosophy in the modern world which is perhaps the most widely influential and the most widely discussed in the world as a whole, and that is Marxism, which does tell people how to live and does give them a complete explanation of the world and of history and of life in general. Do you think that differentiates it from other kinds of philosophy?
It differentiates from other kinds of philosophy to this extent, that it isn't typically a philosophy at all. Marxism is a theory of history, and Marxism says we can explain the development of human society in a causal sort of way, by explaining how human beings developed as they have. There are certain laws, and when you grasp these laws, you will understand why things have happened as they have, why you are where you are on the social map, why you hold the ideas that you do, because perhaps you belong to a given class, and this particular class has the ideas it has because it is engaged in a struggle with certain other classes, and your ideas are in some way determined by your position in the class struggle. Now, this is an empirical theory of history. They may pretend that it's something else, but it is actually an attempt to produce a science of human development, a sociology, in fact, on a level with physics, chemistry, biology, using different concepts, using different categories, of course, but it's a science. And once you understand how human society develops, you will then be able better to operate, to live better, just as if you understand physics, if you know physics, if you understand chemistry, if you understand biology, you are better able to go about the universe without being a victim of unknown forces, which perhaps breed superstition and terror. This is what Marxism claims, but that's not its philosophical aspect. That is simply Marxism as an empirical theory of historical development.
It does offer one a model of society and a model of history and a model of man's relationship to man. And indeed, that brings one to a question that I want to raise with you very much. I talked earlier about how one of the tasks of philosophy and philosophers is to elucidate concepts. But of course, that is only one of the tasks. I mean, concepts are, as it were, atoms of our thinking. But we don't only think with the atoms, we also think in what are usually called models. That is to say, for example, if we're talking about society, some thinkers have seen society as a sort of machine, put together by man to accomplish certain tasks in which the various moving parts connect up with the various moving parts in certain ways. Other people have tended to look on society as a sort of organism, as something that grows like a living thing in the way that the oak comes out of the acorn. Now, depending on which metaphor or which picture or which model, as people usually say, of society you use, you will usually derive all sorts of other practical consequences from it and tend to behave in different ways, have different attitudes to government, to history, and so on. Now, another of the tasks of the philosopher is it not, the critical examination of models?
Yes, this is absolutely true. Marxism is a perfect good example of what you mean. You see, Marxism uses as a model something rather like an evolutionary theory. It applies it to the whole of human society, but Marx himself is perfectly conscious, indeed proud of the fact that he supposed himself to have discovered the, if not the solution, at any rate the road to the solution of what might be called the social development on the analogy of Darwinism in the realm of biological nature. Whether he did or not is another question. That's what Engels claimed for him. And that means that he used this particular model. Now, I think I'm not mistaken in supposing, I've always thought, that the history of philosophy is largely the history of changing models. And the examination of these models is, in a way, a very typical philosophical task. Again, Mr. Forster, everything is like something, what is this like? The only way in which you can explain things to people, usually, is by some kind of analogy, from the known to the unknown. You are faced with something puzzling. What is man? What is human nature? And you say, well, human nature is rather like, take zoology, now we know a great deal more about that. Take botany, we know a good deal about that. Human nature isn't awfully unlike that. There is a general science of all creatures in nature. That's what the 18th century thought. Why should we suppose that human beings are different? What we can do, said Condorcet, for bees and beavers, we ought to do for men. Zoologists are able to produce a science of bees and beavers, and in time we shall have a science of men on the same sound, naturalistic principles. Plato, who is the beginning of all these things, who I suppose it was Whitehead who once said that philosophy was simply a lot of footnotes to Plato. Plato really started all the great questions which have troubled us ever since. Plato thought that the mathematical model was the model, that you could somehow explain the universe in some sort of geometrical terms by deducing what there is from some kind of indestructible ultimate truth, to which he tried to show the path. When you saw the idea of the good, you would understand how everything is necessarily what it is. Everything follows from some huge quasi-mathematical model in which everything fits absolutely precisely as it does in geometry. Aristotle used biological models. Other people used other models. In the 17th century, for example, people tried to explain what society was like in terms of legal models. That's what the social contract is about. And always when a new model comes, it throws light on something. People say, ah, yes, the old model, the old hierarchical model of the Middle Ages in which the thing was like a pyramid or perhaps like an orchestra in which every group of instruments had its own specific function which God assigned to it, that doesn't really explain things. We don't think that there is something really sacred about kings and sacred about great captains, which isn't true about ordinary peasants. This just isn't so. This is much better. Contract. This is the real thing. So that the new model liberates one from the oppression of the old one. And then this model obscures the truths which the old model showed and is in turn replaced by another model. which of course liberates you from the second model, but obscures bits of that. And then the fourth model comes, and the fifth model comes, and so we go from model to model. And why do we choose certain models? Because there are certain problems which oppress us particularly at particular moments of history because of what happens around us, because of the pressures upon us.
It seems to me extraordinary that so many so-called plain men should assert that the critical examination of these models is really an abstract and unrealistic activity, because if you don't drag out into the light the presuppositions of your thinking, especially in moral and political and social spheres, then that makes you simply the prisoner of whatever the reigning orthodoxy is. It makes you the prisoner of the existing model, of the model of your age or the model of your day. And of course, these philosophical ideas that we're discussing have had such immense practical influence. I mean, on the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, on the religions of the world, on the Marxist governments of the world. I mean, these are all examples of how philosophical ideas, in the most direct and obvious way, have practically influenced human beings. So the view that this is sort of unconnected with real life seems to me to be itself unconnected with real life, profoundly unrealistic.
But I entirely agree. I think if ordinary men think so, it's because perhaps some philosophers have used unnecessarily esoteric language for dealing with these things. But of course, one mustn't blame them either. Once one becomes absorbed in a subject, one must be absorbed in its detail too. And although the great philosophers have always spoken in a manner which somehow managed to penetrate to ordinary men, so that they have understood it in some simplified version at least, the minor philosophers tend, I think, perhaps to become occupied with the minutiae of the subject. But that's all it comes to. I think it was Russell who once said something which seemed to me profoundly wise, rather unexpected from him, oddly enough, I think, which is this, that the great, the central philosophies of the great philosophers of the world are essentially simple. That the elaboration is not in the model of the world, not in the pattern in terms of which they saw the world, but in defenses of this pattern against real or imaginary objections. There, of course, a lot of ingenuity comes in, there a lot of technical language comes in, and all this is very necessary. But the fundamental vision is intelligible, is comparatively simple. You really do know the fundamental vision of Descartes, the fundamental vision of Locke, the fundamental vision of Plato, the fundamental vision of Kant, the fundamental vision of some contemporary philosophers too, is intelligible to ordinary men. It isn't esoteric.
Well, I hope we shall succeed in the rest of this series in making some of these visions, as you call them, intelligible to ordinary men. Thank you very much, Sir Isaiah.